600 years before Rome called itself an empire, a Persian king named Cyrus stood before the walls of Babylon and did something no conqueror before him had dared. He offered mercy instead of massacre. Within a generation, his descendants ruled from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, an empire so vast that a courier could ride for 90 days and still not reach its edge. Armies tried to break it. Egypt rebelled and was crushed. Greek city-states won a few battles and lost the war of endurance. Even when Persian kings lost on the battlefield, the empire itself refused to die. Why? Because Persia was never just an army, it was an operating system. Roads, satraps, spies, tribute, and a philosophy of ruling through difference rather than domination. This is the story of how an empire built on diversity became nearly unbreakable, and why understanding its architecture explains almost every empire that came after it. The story of the Persian Empire does not begin with a battle. It begins with a decision made in the mid-6th century BCE by a young ruler of a minor vassal kingdom called Anshan, tucked into the highlands of what is now southern Iran. His name was Cyrus, and the world he was born into was dominated by older, more established powers. The Medes to the north, the Babylonians to the west, the Lydians further west still, and the ancient, wounded civilization of Egypt along the Nile. Persia was a footnote. Within 20 years, it was the footnote that rewrote every other page. Cyrus's rise began with rebellion. Around 550 BCE, he turned against his Median overlords, the very people to whom Persia had paid tribute for generations, and defeated them not merely through force, but through defection. Median nobles, sensing the tide, switched sides. This is the first thread in the pattern that would define Persian expansion for the next 2 centuries. Conquest achieved not solely by superior weapons, but by superior politics. Cyrus did not exterminate the Medes. He absorbed them, elevated many of their aristocrats into his new administration, and presented himself as a continuation rather than a rupture. The empire's DNA was set before its first decade. Lydia fell next. King Croesus, famed for his wealth, marched against Cyrus expecting a seasonal war typical of the era. Armies would fight, then withdraw for winter. Cyrus broke the convention. He pursued Croesus back to his capital at Sardis in the depths of winter, when no one expected an army to still be in the field, and took the city by surprise. The lesson embedded itself into Achaemenid military culture. Unpredictability was a weapon as real as bronze or iron. Babylon, the crown jewel of Mesopotamia, fell in 539 BCE with almost no bloodshed. Cyrus's forces diverted the Euphrates and marched into the city along the riverbed. But the more consequential victory was psychological. Babylon's population had grown resentful of their own king, Nabonidus, who had neglected the city's chief god Marduk in favor of a personal religious project centered on the moon god Sin. Cyrus positioned himself as Marduk's chosen restorer, a narrative preserved on the famous Cyrus cylinder, in which he claims to have been welcomed as a liberator rather than feared as a conqueror. Whether this was propaganda or genuine sentiment is still debated by historians, but the strategic logic is undeniable. Cyrus conquered cities by making their populations complicit in his victory. This is the first pillar of why Persia became so difficult to permanently defeat. It rarely gave conquered peoples a strong enough reason to unify against it. Local elites kept their status. Local religions were tolerated, and in Babylon's and Jerusalem's cases, actively restored. The famous decree allowing Judean exiles to return home and rebuild their temple was not simple altruism. It was imperial engineering. A grateful population is a stable population, and a stable population does not need a garrison on every corner. Cyrus died in 530 BCE, reportedly on campaign against the Massagetæ in Central Asia, one of the few forces that resisted him to the end. His successor, Cambyses, extended the empire's reach into Egypt in 525 BCE. defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. Egypt, with its millennia of independent civilization, was the empire's most prestigious acquisition, and its most dangerous, since Egyptian identity was deeply resistant to foreign rule and would rebel repeatedly over the following 2 centuries. The empire's true architect, however, was not Cyrus or Cambyses, but Darius I, who seized power around 522 BCE amid a succession crisis that nearly tore the empire apart. Darius's own account, carved into the cliff face at Behistun in 3 languages, describes suppressing no fewer than 9 rebellions across the empire within a single year. This moment is crucial to understanding Persian resilience. The empire had already proven, within 1 generation of its founding, that it could survive near total internal collapse and recohere. Most empires that face simultaneous multi-front rebellion in their infancy do not survive it. Persia did, and used the crisis to redesign itself into something far more durable. Darius's reforms are the second pillar of Persian strength. He divided the empire into administrative provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, often a Persian noble, sometimes a local aristocrat, who managed taxation, justice, and local order, while military command in many provinces was held by a separate officer reporting independently to the king. This deliberate separation of civil and military authority meant that no single regional governor could easily accumulate enough power to challenge the throne without needing to coordinate with a rival power structure. It was, in effect, an ancient system of institutional checks and balances designed to prevent the empire from being defeated from within, which historically is how most empires actually die. Darius also standardized taxation into fixed tribute assessments per satrapy, paid partly in silver and partly in kind, grain, horses, or specialized goods particular to each region. Herodotus catalogs these tribute amounts in detail, and while his figures are debated by modern historians, the broader picture is clear. Persia extracted resources through a predictable bureaucratic system rather than through ad hoc plunder, which reduced the incentive for provinces to revolt purely over economic exploitation. Then came the roads. The Royal Road, stretching roughly 2,700 kilometers from Sardis in the west to Susa in the Persian heartland, was equipped with way stations spaced a day's ride apart, allowing royal messengers using the relay system Herodotus described, men and horses handing off dispatches like a relay race, to cross in about a week what would normally take 90 days on foot. This is often cited as inspiration for the modern postal service motto about neither snow nor rain stopping the couriers. But the road's real military value was troop mobility. An army stationed at the empire's Anatolian frontier could, in principle, reach Mesopotamia in a fraction of the time any rival power could organize a comparable response. Infrastructure was not a convenience. It was a weapon system. The empire also fielded an extraordinarily diverse military. The core professional force, the so-called 10,000 immortals, were an elite Persian and Median infantry corps whose numbers were reportedly maintained at exactly 10,000 at all times, with a replacement waiting whenever a soldier fell, died, or fell ill, hence the name Greek writers gave them. But the immortals were only the ceremonial corps. The bulk of Persian armies were levied from across the empire's dozens of subject peoples. Bactrian cavalry, Scythian horse archers, Egyptian marines, Phoenician and Ionian Greek fleets, Indian infantry, Ethiopian archers. Herodotus's description of Xerxes's invasion force lists an almost absurd catalog of nations, each fighting in their own traditional armor and style. This diversity was a double-edged sword. Coordination was difficult, and different contingents had different loyalties and combat doctrines, but it also meant that no single defeat could cripple the whole. Losing a battle in Greece did not mean losing Bactrian cavalry, Egyptian shipwrights, or Babylonian grain reserves. The empire could absorb catastrophic losses on one front while remaining fully intact everywhere else, a strategic depth almost no contemporary rival possessed. This is the paradox that defines part one of our story. Persia's greatest military defeats, and there were real ones, barely damaged Persia at all. When the Ionian Greek cities revolted starting in 499 BCE with support from Athens, they briefly burned the regional capital of Sardis before being crushed at the Battle of Lade in 494 BCE. When Darius sent a punitive expedition against mainland Greece and lost decisively at Marathon in 490 BCE, it was a humiliating tactical defeat, but strategically almost irrelevant to an empire whose annual tribute, population, and territory dwarfed the entire Greek world combined. Persia could lose Marathon 100 times and still remain the dominant power on earth. Athens could not survive a single catastrophic defeat of similar proportion. This asymmetry of consequence is the single most important reason the Persian Empire proved so difficult to permanently defeat. It had so much strategic depth that individual defeats were absorbed like a wave hitting a continent rather than a boat. By the time Xerxes launched the Great Invasion of Greece in 480 BCE, a campaign 4 years in preparation, involving a canal dug through the Athos Peninsula to avoid the fate of a previous fleet wrecked rounding it, and a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, the Persian Empire had already survived Egyptian revolt, Babylonian revolt not once but twice, Ionian revolt, and a disputed succession. Greece, for all its later mythologizing in Western memory, was a peripheral theater for a power whose center of gravity lay in Mesopotamia, Persia proper, and the wealth of Egypt and Anatolia. The war that Herodotus immortalized as a clash of civilizations was, from the Persian throne's perspective, one campaign among many across a multi-continental empire, and even its failure at Salamis and Plataea did not touch the empire's core territories, tax base, or administrative machinery in any lasting way. This is where Part 1 leaves the story. An empire that had already demonstrated, within decades of its founding, an almost unprecedented capacity to lose battles without losing wars, to lose provinces without losing cohesion, and to absorb internal rebellion without institutional collapse. In Part 2, we examine how this system handled its greatest tests, sustained Greek resistance, internal succession crises, and the slow erosion of central authority, and why, even in decline, the empire took the combined genius and audacity of Alexander of Macedon to finally bring down. But Persia's greatest tests were still to come, battles that would push the empire to its limits, and a slow unraveling that even brilliant reform could not fully arrest.